The 2012 campaign, the role of the primaries, nominating conventions, and presidential debates, moderated by Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post, Eugene Robinson.
How you doing?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks so much for coming this morning. This is a wonderful, beautiful theater we're in today, and I think we have a fabulous panel. We're going to be talking about the role of the primaries, the conventions, and the debates in our presidential election process. I can't think of better people, some of whom have battle scars from primaries, conventions, and debates, to talk about it and to talk about not only where we've been historically, but where we are now. So, to my far right is Elaine Kamarck. She's a lecturer at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard. A former Clinton administration senior policy advisor, longtime Democratic Party official, activist, bottle washer, and member of the Democratic National Committee. A bit closer, Paul Kirk, former senator, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, former co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates, and a former chairman of the National Democratic Institute. To my far left, Governor Howard Dean, former governor of Vermont, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, former presidential candidate, occasional colleague on the set at MSNBC. And to my immediate left.
Only today am I on your left.
Well, we'll see. We'll have the discussion. We'll see where we are. To my left, only for today, Frank Fahrenkopf, former chairman of the Republican National Committee, who has been brave enough to venture into what's been called the lion's den, but we are declawed this morning.
Thank you.
Who also co-chairman of the Commission on Presidential Debates, and a veteran of the political wars. And so we're going to start by talking about the primaries. And so let me throw out a thesis. If I were a man from Mars and I had landed on this planet in time to watch the primary season unfold this year on the Republican side, I think I would conclude that the role of the presidential primaries is to drive candidates of both parties so far to the extremes that it then becomes impossible for them to agree on anything once the election is over. And I might conclude that the primary process, in fact, contributes to our government gridlock. Would you? So, Governor Dean, you've been a participant in this process. What do you think?
I think there's some truth to that. I think that it is true. I think Governor Romney, for example, has been very much hurt by the length of the primary system on the Republican side, because he's had to say some things to cater to his base that are clearly outside where most Americans are. And I think that happens on both sides. So I think a worse problem is redistricting. That is, the way that the congressional districts are drawn by both parties is that each party tends to have safe districts, which means that your major challenges from the extreme rather than from the other party. So it's a complex problem, but I do think, I have to agree with Gene. I might not have agreed with you 15, 20 years ago, but I do agree now that in both parties, the activists in the party play a very, very important role in the nominating process, and that does skew, I think, the primaries towards the ends of the spectrum, both left and right.
The only comment I would make is that I'm not sure I agree with the thesis, if I understood you correctly. I agree that the side effect is what happens. The fact of the matter is that the primary process, its mission or part of its purpose is to get more people engaged in the political process as they think about who they want to lead the country. And the more people you get in, and the more they're proportionally represented to the number of delegates that they bring to the convention, then I think it's a healthier process. The governor is absolutely right. The gerrymandering has not been, the way it's worked out has not been helpful to stronger democracy. We've redistricted these, so as he says, those safe seats, they're predictable, they're going to be either Democrat or Republican, so that the moderate voter is squeezed to the side, if you will, and it's only the activists, as a result of this, that usually get involved in the primaries, and they are farther on each side than maybe any one of us who's been through the process would prefer. And and then we, it all plays out, as Elaine knows, in how things are shaped on a platform and who the profile is of the ultimate nominee.
Now, Elaine, you look at this.
Let me just add a couple numbers to this. Participation in congressional primaries averages 3% of the voting age population. So if you want to know the source of polarization in American politics, you have to look at congressional primaries. For those of you who come from democracies, but parliamentary democracies, you're probably familiar with a central listing of your parliamentary candidates by parties. There is no such thing in the American democracy. It's a purely entrepreneurial system. Anybody who decides they want to run for Congress can run for Congress. And these congressional primaries are held at odd times throughout the year, lots of them in the middle of the summer. Participation has been traditionally extremely low. In one of the most contested years, 2010, participation in those congressional primaries got up to a whopping 7.5%. So this is a very small sliver of the electorate that influences who gets to run for Congress. And then, as Governor Dean and Chairman Kirk have pointed out, they run in gerrymandered districts. So the contest really isn't at the general election. The contest is at the primaries. And it does create an incentive system in the congressional system that skews you to the right if you're a Republican, to the left if you're a Democrat.
But if we could...
Let me just add one thing there, if I
yeah,
can
well,
follow
I
up
was
on your
going to go to
original
you,
question.
Frank.
Okay, go ahead. No,
Well,
go ahead.
what I was just going to bring us from the general to the specific. I wanted to talk about this year a bit and ask you
That's what I was going to comment on.
about an issue like immigration, for example, on which I suspect in my heart of hearts that Mitt Romney would want to take a position that might perhaps support the DREAM Act, or that might perhaps be somewhat less absolute and hard line than the position he in fact took because he needed to win the Republican primaries.
A tactical mistake was made, in my view, by the Republican National Committee in changing the winner-take-all primary system that we had had for years. I used to tease Paul and his predecessor, Chuck Manette. I say, why in the world would you adopt a primary system that's different than the general election system? Since the general election, other than in a couple of states, is winner-take-all, why would you have a primary system that is proportional, where you're dividing up things? Because what it does is extends the time in order to wrap up the nomination. So, and I felt it had a great deal to do, because through Reagan and with Bush 1, we were putting in place in these states for the primary the infrastructure that we could just automatically move into in the general election, which was winner-take-all. So I think that the decision was made by the prior RNC chairman to change the rules for this year was detrimental in that it did drag things out, but actually in a way I think it's going to prove helpful. I happen to be one of those who think that being beat up the way he was in the primaries is going to prepare him for going into the debates coming down the road. I mean, Bain was old news by the time the campaign shifted directly to him, and some of those other things. So I think he'll be better in the debates because he went through that process. But if I was the next chairman of the Republican National Committee, and no, I don't want to go back there, been there, done that, I would go back to the way we used to do it. With regard to what his position is on immigration, that's not my job anymore. I don't get into the issue.
Well, everything's everybody's job this morning. Because it's a serious question. Does the primary process, did it in this specific instance drive Mitt Romney, in the opinion of the panel, into some positions on the far right in order to outflank his opponents, positions that are inconvenient for him? He's by 4-1, he's losing the Latino vote. 85% of Latinos support the DREAM Act. He's taken a position that doesn't admit the possibility of going
Difficulties for the Republican Party with Latino voters started long before Mitt Romney's position. I mean, if you had to put your finger directly on something, it was my old friend Pete Wilson when he went back to become governor. That's when it started. So I don't think that is the difficulty, and the campaign will determine whether or not the Republican candidates can appeal to Hispanic voters. But what happens in the primaries, the most active voters in the Democratic primary tend to be those who are activists, who maybe tend to be a little left of center of the party. In the Republican Party, those activists who are out there tend to be right of where most Republicans are. And it's the same thing, the people who are going to be here, and we're in Tampa. I was in Tampa last week. That audience was to the right, I think, of where most Americans and most Republicans are. And this audience that's going to be here, this will be primarily a little bit to the left. So it does have the pressure that you're talking about of pushing the candidates to take positions that are going to be necessary to win the nomination.
I think one other question that members of the audience might have, and I've certainly wondered about, is, Paul Kirk, why do we allow Iowa and to a certain extent New Hampshire to choose our next president? How did that happen? I mean, why those states?
Well, Elaine's a better historian than I am on this, but I will say in defense of Iowa and New Hampshire, particularly in this day and age, where there's too much money in politics, most of it is used on negative advertising, that the opportunity for a presidential candidate or aspirant to engage him or herself in retail politics in a small state and able to get around into the country stores and the drugstores and so forth and meet people and make an impression is a very, very important aspect of direct democratic engagement, if you will. The alternative is paid advertising, press conferences on a tarmac, flying off to another state to do a news conference. So you never get the kind of initial grassroots input that I think is helpful in defining the values and the vision of the candidate. As it goes on, you're going into other states. We have sort of semi-regional primaries. There's been a temptation to go to kind of a super primary, which would be almost a national primary, which I think would be criminal in the political sense of having a one-day snapshot, and usually a snapshot taken of either the person with the most famous name or the most money. And that's not really the way our democracy is designed or should be designed. So I know people beat up on Iowa and New Hampshire, Gene, but whether it was those two states or any other 2 or 3 or 4 states that are early and take the measure of the candidate and let the media analyze, I think is a healthy thing.
Nothing against Iowa, nothing against New Hampshire, but Elaine?
Well, Paul is absolutely right, and there's been an interesting consensus between the two political parties that we're going to let Iowa and New Hampshire go first for that very reason. It's the only place you can do some hand-to-hand, person-to-person politicking. But it happened really by accident. The New Hampshire primary has been the first primary in the country since 1922. It's always been the first primary. It's just that for many, many years, primaries didn't matter. It wasn't until 1972, after the Democratic Party had a reform movement that inadvertently affected the Republican Party as well, that primaries got to be important. So, for instance, if you look back historically, You could tell, Lyndon Johnson knew he was in trouble when he didn't do as well as he should have in the 1968 New Hampshire primary. The next month, he decided not to run for re-election. Okay, I mean, so politicians had used these primaries as a kind of signal as to whether or not there was trouble brewing. But what happened after the reform movement was we moved to a total primary system, and suddenly New Hampshire and Iowa took on a meaning that was unanticipated because the momentum out of those primaries had an effect on the subsequent primaries, and we've been there ever since.
Gene, I've got to make one point about this.
Yeah, just quickly.
What Elaine says is true, and what Paul says is absolutely true. You've got to start off with the small states where you can do retail politics. The problem in the Democratic Party is we're an incredibly diverse party, and one of the first things I did when I was chair is we moved South Carolina and Nevada into that so that we could have Hispanics, American Indians, and African Americans, who are a major part of our party, be able to cast that first vote. It's still not right because they're not equal. That is, it's New Hampshire and Iowa, and then, or Iowa and New Hampshire, and then South Carolina and Nevada. So I do agree with you on the small state stuff, but I think, at least for our side, we have got to figure out a way to have geographic diversity and racial diversity, and we're not quite there yet, although we've improved matters, I think, since 2004.
Let's move to the subject of conventions. I remember when I was a kid watching wall-to-wall network coverage of the conventions, and there was suspense, and of course there was 1968, which was,
Amazing.
the convention and all conventions.
Yes, that's
right.
Almost did.
Almost did, right, inside the hall and outside the hall. So here we are in Charlotte, and why are we here? What are we doing? And is this more than an infomercial?
Let me start by that. I'm asked this all the time about conventions, and I think it's more important this year, as it always is for the challenger, because the challenger gets a chance to have a stage to lay out where he or she wants to take the country, and so forth. It's less important, I think, for an incumbent who's well known. But one of the things I think that's missed in all this criticism, and in 1984, we had produced a film on Ronald Reagan's history, which we wanted to use to introduce him at the podium. And I went through hell arguing with the networks. They didn't want to show it. That's when this really started, this whole approach. We're not going to automatically show everything you guys put up there. And we were unsuccessful. We ran it, but they didn't show it. But another important function, in my view, of the conventions is that it's the only time every 4 years that Republican and Democrat activists get together in one place, leaders from the various states, where they meet, they discuss, they talked about best practices. There's a lot of other things that go on beyond the television camera that I think is important for the party process. Now, Paul, correct me, did you try to do one every 2 years or something because of the importance of that sort of thing? I've forgotten.
We did at one point, yeah. We actually had midterm conferences. The first one was in 1978. It was such a disaster for President Carter that we never had another one again.
Well,
so
there you have
that
it.
was the end of that.
But I'll say this, that you have to look at these, my view, you have to look at these national conventions in the context of, there's a contest to win the presidency in the general election. And while for the nominating process, the next couple of days be a ratification of what the delegates did in the primaries, and there'll be no contest at the convention, Frank is right that it's an opportunity to unite the party in the best way. Unite whatever disparate groups and issues that may be at play, but equally important, to unite the congressional and the presidential or national party, to unite that with the state and local parties, and unite all of those with the grassroots activists who are there or here at the convention as delegates, and to energize them and to get them on a single page to the degree that can be done. And one of the things that I always used to say when I was chairman, if the people see that a particular party can't govern its own business, they're going to be much less apt to ask us or grant us the opportunity to govern the business of the nation. So from a chairman's point of view, party unity, party discipline, and the other thing that Frank mentioned here, and a salute to Chairman Dean, in terms of party building, at conventions, you can, at the kickoff of the general election, do your final training, your final organization, and your final sort of strategic practice going back to the respective states. So there's a lot of stuff from the party point of view that I think is important.
Absolutely, and but you know, we used to have 4-day conventions. This year, both will end up being 3-day conventions. And I frankly, will we have 4-day conventions next time around? I kind of doubt it.
No, you won't.
Will we go down? When will we go down to 2 days? I mean, what, you know, the governor.
You won't go down to 2 days, and you won't go up to 4 days again, and I think that's appropriate. But you know, you used the word infomercial. It is an infomercial, but I think that both candidates of each major party ought to be able to, at least for 3 days, get their unfiltered views and not filtered by the media.
But we're just a neutral filter.
Let them
Transparent as we
say
can
whatever outlandish things they want to say, unfiltered, and let the American people decide for themselves. And it's not really unfiltered because you've got MSNBC and Fox and everybody else commenting on every word as it comes out. But I do think it's valuable. I do think they're valuable, and I also think they're valuable for the reasons that Frank said, that this notion of getting activists in one place at one time, for one time for 4 years. I think it's an institution. It looks like it's sort of kabuki to the average citizen, but I do think in a functioning democracy which is based on a party system, that it's very important to continue to do.
Can I just add a little reality check? We think conventions are obsolete because most of the time the nominee is selected in the primary system. So we come here to Charlotte and it's done. But guess what? The convention actually still has the legal authority to determine the nominee. So the Republicans, if you notice in Tampa, they moved the roll call vote up to the very, very first night because they needed to have that legal stamp of approval to make Mitt Romney the legal nominee. That if they'd had a hurricane and had to all disperse, they would have been in trouble. We have had in the modern era 3 instances where the nomination was not settled by the convention. In 1976, the Republicans came together, and Ronald Reagan was 100 votes behind President Ford. And they had one heck of an old-fashioned convention. Nobody called that convention an infomercial, right? That convention was like the old-fashioned conventions were. Paul Kirk and I met in 1980, where Ted Kennedy came into the convention, a couple hundred votes short of Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter. That was a rip-roaring convention. People were glued to their televisions because guess what? It was really, really interesting. And of course, in 1972, you had a coalition within the Democratic Party, anybody but McGovern, trying to unseat McGovern at that convention. So it happens, it doesn't happen as often as it used to be when the convention was really where all the action was, but it is still possible in this day and age that the primaries won't settle the situation, and you will have a convention that, rather than being 3 days and kind of boring and an infomercial, is a convention that everybody's eyes are glued to.
And what's changed, too, is the network coverage, as you mentioned.
I was just going to get to that, right.
I mean, it used to be that you had 3 major networks back then covering everything gavel to gavel, slowly started to shrink. But, you know, you could get as much of this week here and last week in Tampa, whether you go to C-SPAN or you go to MSNBC or you go to Fox or you go to CNN. They covered most of the important things. So the major networks, you know, they're in trouble anyway. They want to do something that they can sell advertising for.
Well, but you know, the broadcast networks are giving 1 hour of prime time per evening, unless there's a football game that they have to show seriously, and that they have to show instead. And I believe NBC on Wednesday is going to show its football game, and not going to show, for example, President Clinton's speech. It will be on MSNBC, but not on the broadcast network. You know, when that broadcast hour comes, For something like Mitt Romney's speech, the audience went up from something like 10 million watching on all the cable networks to something closer to 40 million, 30 to 40 million watching on all the cable plus the broadcast. And that's a big jump, and that's a big audience. So how important is that hour, the candidate's speech, the rambling, inappropriate monologue by Clint Eastwood, all the traditional elements of that night at the convention? How important is that hour? And really, is the convention about producing a television show?
This is you have to understand. And three of us up here have actually done these conventions. We have people who run the Super Bowl and doing our production. I mean, that's how carefully scripted these things are. We have people who've done 6 or 8 conventions over the period of time. I asked one of the big producers, I said, how do you stand this? It drives you crazy. He said, my memory only extends for 3 years, and then I forget, and I say, agree to do the 4th one. But these are huge deals, and to get an hour of primetime television with 40 million Americans watching, that is really, really an important thing for us. And so we are very careful about what we put in that hour. Obviously, the Republicans made a little mistake this time, but that happens to everybody. I'm sure we've had some things in our primetime coverage, but that hour of primetime that you get each night is really, really critical, and everything goes into making sure that you put your very best foot forward with your most important people in that hour.
The other thing, Gene, is I think the most important thing about that hour, whether it's in Tampa or Charlotte or wherever, this is the kickoff of the general election and the windup of the primary season to the nomination. But in kicking off the general election at the National Convention and accepting the nomination and delivering the speech, the nominee has an opportunity to really set his vision or her vision and values for the country and articulate the choices between, in most instances in our country, the 2 major political parties. And that basically, in some ways, sets the tone for debates to come, for the print media to say, this is what he said, this is the stark difference, this is, if people are paying attention. And that's another thing about the conventions. Hopefully you get people to start saying, oh, it's coming. I better start tuning in. But this is setting the tone for the general election. And it's an important moment. If you didn't have that hour in which the nominee could do that, I think as bad as the turnout is, it could arguably be even worse. People are getting their source of information on all different avenues and medium these days. So I think it really does have an effect.
So Elaine, when the camera's not on, when it's not prime time, what are you delegates doing anyhow? What are you spending all your time doing?
Well, this morning at the Massachusetts delegation meeting, we heard from our governor, and we heard from our Senate candidate, Elizabeth Warren, and we had lots of people revving us up and telling us. We had the Obama campaign person telling those of us in Massachusetts, which is a very blue state, so we're going to go for Obama, telling us to go to New Hampshire, which is a swing state, and do all the campaigning that we can to try to put New Hampshire's 4 electoral votes in the Democratic column. It's that kind of activity that goes on in these state delegation meetings. You also, frankly, and this is where I think Howard said it best, this is where the party comes together every 4 years. So for instance, those of us who are active from year to year and consider ourselves sort of Democrats, not only from the heart but by profession, we're looking around. Who's a good presidential candidate? Okay, who might be running in 2016, right? Who might be running for Senate from my state or another state? You know, people are looking around, checking out the talent, so to speak.
How'd that Marco Rubio look to you?
Looked pretty good, didn't he? Thought he looked great. But she's right. That's another thing that we forgot to mention. It really is a showcase, in a way, for new talent in the party. Now, I don't know when he's going to speak. One of the other things I do in life that's fun is I'm on the board of the Culinary Institute of America. And we just opened a new campus in San Antonio focusing on Hispanic food. And I got to meet this young mayor who, is he the keynote or he's going to give a major speech?
Castro
Very,
of
very
San Antonio,
impressive guy. And so it's giving him the opportunity to be seen by people around the country, as it was for the president 8 years ago. Bill Clinton didn't do quite as well when he had his chance.
He did not. But he recovered.
But
He's
that's
a
an
comeback
important.
kid.
I think that's an important part of the conventions.
One quick question. I don't know the answer to it. Someone might know. Where does the balloon drop come from? Who first did the balloon drop? Does anybody know?
I would guess that it came at the Republican conventions following the Civil War, where they had a tradition called wide awakes, which were not only sort of huge festivities in the hall, but then they had torchlight parades through the city following their conventions, and they kept that up all the way through election night. A lot of the people in the Republican Party back then were Civil War veterans, and so this is how they marched, because that's what they were used to doing. So that's my guess, is it probably comes from that era.
We're going with that. We're going with that. Absolutely.
That's where the hot air came from.
No, there's no shortage of that in either convention, believe me. Well, let's move on to debates. And we're fortunate to have two members, one emeritus of the debate commission. Seems like almost every election we say, the debates are going to be crucial. We're certainly saying that this year. Why, and are they real debates?
The answer to the question why is that I think people are more turned off by the proliferation of paid advertising at enormous expense and very prolonged nominating process. And I think that in the midst of that, you have 4 nights where the candidates for Vice President and President of the United States will be face-to-face in the least packaged, most unvarnished setting, where the television will be right on them, will show their connectivity, if you will, with people at their kitchen tables at home, the relationship to the values and issues that they're worried about, the ability from one candidate and another to relate to one another in a way that doesn't turn people off. So this is the window, or they are the windows of opportunity that are, I think, unique and becoming more so. And this year, I think for those of us who follow these processes, I can remember, not when I was chairman, but a little bit after that, and it's I think it was about 92 or so, they used to say, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two major political parties. And so then you had Ross Perot rattling around and so forth and making an impression. And today, no one will say there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two political parties. I don't remember a time when the choice is clearer about the direction that the American people decide they want their nation to follow. So we'll have the biggest audience ever,
I think so,
without any
yeah.
question.
I think so. We didn't always have debates. Most people forget the history. In the modern time, television time, the first debate was the Kennedy-Nixon debate, which were in 1960. And then we went 16 years without a presidential debate. Lyndon Johnson was no way in hell going to allow Barry Goldwater to get up on the stage with him. Right. His view, which may be true, that as soon as you let the opponent get up on the stage, you're raising his or her stature. Nixon's experience in '60, he had so many scars. Right. He wasn't going to debate in his 2 runs. And really, if it hadn't been for the fact that Ford was in so much trouble after the pardon of Nixon, that he had to debate Jimmy Carter. Then most people forget, in 1980, there was a 3rd candidate. That's right. His name was John Anderson. He was a congressman from Chicago, or from Illinois, I'm not sure it was Chicago. And at that time, the League of Women Voters were doing the debates, and they had a rule that we still have. you have to be at 15% in the polls. And when the first debate rolled around, Anderson was at 17% in the polls. So he was invited to do the debate, which was in Baltimore. I was there. But Jimmy Carter said, I will not participate in the debates if Anderson's there. So the first debate that year took place just between Ronald Reagan and John Anderson. By the time the second debate came, he'd fallen below the 15%, and you had one debate. So it's been a long process. But I think what's most important this time is, and it's taken us a long time, Paul and I went through some tough times over the years, 2 steps forward and 1 back always, because nothing angers the campaign aides of the presidential candidates, who in some cases have been working for 4 years to get it to election day, when some outside group, and we still are an outside group, we get no money from the government, no money from the parties, you know, we raised our own funds, we're a private entity, come in the last month and tell the candidates you're going to do a certain thing. But this year we really are changing the format on the first and the last debate. The first debate, which is October 3rd, 4 weeks later, the final debate will be held about 10 days before the election. First we'll focus on domestic politics, the last on foreign policy. And those 90 minutes will be divided into 6 15-minute pods. And this month, probably at the middle of this month, Jim Lara and Bob Schieffer, who are going to be the moderators of those respective, are going to announce in advance to the candidates what's going to be covered in each of the 6 pods. Now, domestic relations, you know, it's going to be the deficit, unemployment, and so forth. And then the candidates will start, they'll each get 2 minutes to start, they'll make their statement, and then the moderators will be able to drill down for the rest of that. They're not going to be able to just give their, pablum answers they've given on the campaign trail. The moderators are going to really get down to the substance. And as Paul said, I don't think, in my experience, there's been an election where the 2 parties and the candidates want to take the country in different directions and really think that that's going to work out. We're also going to have a town hall meeting. That'll be done with a smaller audience. We've had 100 people. They're the ones who asked the question. We'll probably be down to 20 or 25, and then there'll be a vice presidential debate. So we think it's going to be very, very important in this cycle.
The debates do have a history. Do the panelists have a favorite debate moment from past debates?
We were speaking, I think the most memorable one, which had no effect on the race, I might add, but I think most of the people who are in politics would remember the vice presidential debate between Senator Lloyd Bentsen and Senator Dan Quayle. It was I've never seen such a thing. Somebody has deflated my whole life, and I actually felt terrible for Quayle, and never ever wanted to go up against Lloyd Bentsen under any circumstances.
Describe what happened.
Dan Quayle, who had been sort of pilloried by the press as somebody who wasn't as knowledgeable as he should have been, fairly or not, said something like to the effect of something that Senator Kennedy had done. And he didn't mean to compare himself to Senator Kennedy, but he said, well, Senator Kennedy voted for this, as did I, or something like that. And Bentsen drew him up to himself up to his full height, which was considerable, and looked at him and said, Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy. I mean, I was just so glad I wasn't on that stage.
There's David Gergen and I teach a class every election year at the Kennedy School on elections, right, in presidential elections. And thanks to the era of technology, when we can get all sorts of video in our classroom, we actually show great debate moments. And it's so important to actually see them as opposed to read a history book about them, which is what we used to have to do when we taught presidential politics. And one of the moments that always takes my students aback is the moment in the Mondale-Reagan debate in 1984, when Ronald Reagan started wandering down the California highway in his mind. It was clearly and we now know he had Alzheimer's. Obviously, it comes on slowly. This was clearly a weird moment. You see in the debate footage, you see Mondale kind of looking at him like, what's going on with this guy? It was very, very strange. Afterwards, there was a lot of press discussion about whether or not President Reagan was senile, and was he up to the job? Was he too old? And then, of course, in the very next debate, which you also have to watch, Reagan comes back with one of the greatest lines in all debates, which is, "I refuse to make an issue of my opponent's youth and inexperience." And the election was gone. I mean, those of us in the Mondale
I'll tell you an
campaign
interesting
were like,
sidebar to that. That first debate was in Louisville, I think. And in the basement of the hall, Jim Baker, Mike Deaver, myself, Paul Laxalt, Ed Rollins, a crew, Lynn Nofziger. And when that debate ended, we were just all sitting there quiet until Jim Baker said, "We won! Now get out there and tell everyone how we won." And, but then the next debate came, and I remember my chief of staff, Bill Phillips, and I were sitting in the front row in Kansas City, and Mrs. Mondale and one of the daughters, or her daughter, was sitting directly behind me. And President Reagan came out, and he was right up above me. And when that question was being asked, I think by a Wall Street Journal reporter about whether or not he was old, too old, the president looked down at me and he gave me a wink, and I said to Bill, "I don't know what he's going to say, but he's ready." And he was ready.
He was ready,
Okay.
yeah.
And the moment the Mondale daughter said, "Mom, oh my God," and you remember, and Fritz was laughing himself. And
Yeah,
he
yeah,
later
Fritz.
told me when Paul and I were at the Humphrey Center at the University of Minnesota a year or so ago that he knew at that moment that the election was over.
Yeah.
You talked about, afterwards in your instructions from Jim Baker, we won.
Yeah.
So we can't talk about debates without talking about the unique American institution, the spin room, which is after the debate. Representatives from both sides descend on members of the media in what has become known as the spin room, and it's like a huge gathering of dervishes. I mean, there is more spinning going on in there. It is breathtaking.
I saw Howard 4 years ago after the debate, and there was someone walking in front of him with a big sign with his name on it so that all the reporters would know where they could find him in the crowd.
Yes, it is an absolute
Well,
madhouse.
Right?
We did not invent spin. Spin is modeled after the former Soviet Union's propaganda. The only thing that's different about it is you have two opposing, this is a free market of ideas, so you have
Right.
two different spinners in different directions.
Right.
It is, I mean, in some ways, I'm sorry we don't have a member of the press up here. We do, but
We
you're,
do.
you're the moderator.
No, it's
but you've
ridiculous.
been spun. I can't
have
imagine
been
how.
spun.
Yeah. I mean, what's it like to be spun?
Well, it's you wonder, why am I doing this? Because you've got one side, explaining how candidate X clearly won, dominated, answered every question, just destroyed the opponent, and then no. In the other ear, you've got candidate Y's people saying, candidate Y wiped the floor with candidate X. It was not
all with rehearsed talking
All with
points.
rehearsed.
Yeah,
And
right.
you're
They've
going like this.
got the list of talking. Why don't you guys just email me the talking points and save me trouble, and I might make my deadline. Because
there's a sort of method to this madness, and it is madness, which is that X millions of people will actually watch the debate, but then there will be 5 or 6 days of mulling over the debate. And what happens in the spin room is everybody tries to get their best moment. And if you can identify to the reporters and to the producers of the television networks the moment that really matters in that debate, if you can identify that, guess what? That moment will get played over and over and over ad nauseum. So if you can identify your opponent's worst moment, that's going to be dominating the press. If you can identify your own guy's best moment, you hope that that'll be dominating. So this is not just about, spin is not just about that night. Spin is about the 4 or 5 days of stories from that night until then something else happens and
Right.
you move on
And
to
we start-
another piece of
Gee,
coverage.
one of the
spun about
interesting
something
things that we've got to do, I haven't talked to Paul about it yet, or Mike McCurry, my now co-chairman, that is of some concern is, in 2008, in the last presidential election, about 30% of the votes had been cast prior to Election Day. Because more and more states are
Yeah.
going with early voting. I've seen some estimates that this year the projection is that maybe 40% will be cast before actual, which is November 6th, I think it is.
That's a good point, yes.
And the question is, for us on the debate commission, we have traditionally been in October. I think voting starts, maybe it's in Iowa, I saw something in the paper, that one state starts voting September 26th. You can start casting your votes. Whether or not we're going to have to move the debates forward in time to take advantage of the problem that will be presented by early voting.
I would, not that I'm part of the commission, but I don't worry about the early votes. Each party tries to get as many early votes as possible, because obviously once they're there, actually in Vermont you can actually change your vote. You can go, you can't go back in and change it, but you can, if you've voted by absentee ballot, you can then on election day go in and say,
really? Wow.
And cast a vote, and they'll throw out the other ballot. But the truth is that the people that do vote early, they're not going to change their minds. I would say in this particular election, which is I'd say 45% of the people on each side have decided how they're going to vote. So there's really only talking about the 10% in the middle, and that's of course the people who watch the debate very, very carefully. Most of the people who watch the debates are not watching it because they hope to learn somebody's position. It's like watching the Giants against the Bears in the Super Bowl. They're really just rooting for their guys and hoping to see a knockout punch, and it's a sports event. And in this year's election, because the country is so polarized, there'll probably only be about 10%, and those people will wait for the last minute. So it is true that there'll be a lot of people who cast their votes early. Part of the reason they do it is so they don't have to pay any attention to the horrible advertising that goes on for the last 30 days. But I don't think it's going to have much of an. I wouldn't move the debates because of it, because I think it has a relatively tiny effect. There are very few people who really change their mind.
The other problem, as Frank is quite aware, is that to move the debates on the calendar where you have the World Series playoffs, you have the NFL, sometimes the Olympics, and Gene alluded to it earlier, the networks are interested in revenues, bottom line, and it's like trying to thread a needle, quite frankly, to get a measured space between, in a very limited calendar. You have some religious holidays, all these other competing things. So the practicality of trying to move them be difficult in any event.
Well, we're all going to be watching. We're all going to be watching this year. So thanks so much, panelists. Now we have some time for questions from the audience, and so we would like to move to that phase to give you an opportunity to ask our august panel questions that we didn't get to.
There are mics out there?
Yes, sir. Are there microphones anywhere? I think there are mics over there.
And there's a mic over there and over there.
Yeah,
so
there's a microphone over there on the side.
None in these middle.
On both sides, there are microphones.
And at the back,
perhaps it would be best to kind of head toward those.
Is there one up in the
Thank
balcony?
You. So starting over there.
I'm Zoe Sanders. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina, so not too far away.
Hi, Zoe.
My question involves one of the first topics you talked about, in that the primaries pushing candidates to a position that's too extreme. Are we willing to presuppose that these candidates, who are going to be the leaders of the free world, are taking positions that they don't believe in? Are we willing to accept that premise just to win?
The good news is you and I and a lot of others, we should rely on the wisdom of the American people to say, I'm not going to necessarily pledge my allegiance to someone who's going to, take a position he or she doesn't believe in. And if you feel that you know that's the case, my bet is you're not going to be for him or her. So, I mean, all these situations, we watch them time after time. I got to say, not enough American people are engaged in the process, but that's what we have. It's the people's choice. And if they see that the kind of thing that you're describing, my hope would be that they'd say that that's not what I want to do.
My view is that it's shocking, but I think it's happened. Okay? I mean, I do think that people have moved to positions that they don't necessarily really share. But yes, sir.
Sir, my name is Hans van Balen, European Parliament, and I'm president of Liberal International. I was campaign leader also for my party, and we believe that dirty campaigning didn't work. If we look at the American situation, I think it works. What is your opinion?
Let me tell you why it works less well in Europe than it does here. It's actually not Europe, it's about parliamentary democracies. Dirty campaigning doesn't work here either if there are 3 candidates in the race, or 4. Because when you put out what you would call dirty campaigning, we call negative ads. The spinmeisters call them educational television. But when you do that, you drive up your own negatives as well as the other person's negatives. And in a 2-person race, it turns out that you drive the other person's negatives up higher than you drive your own, but they don't like either one of you, which is one of the reasons that Americans don't like politicians very much. In a parliamentary democracy where you might have 3 or 4 parties, and here, for example, in Minnesota, a professional wrestler ended up in the governor's office because the 2 mainstream parties beat each other up so much that people were so disgusted with both of them that they voted for the professional wrestler, Jesse Ventura, who was governor for a term. So the reason it doesn't work in Europe is not because Europeans are inherently different kinds of human beings than Americans are. It's because when you are attacking somebody else and driving your own negatives up, if there's another person in the race that isn't engaging in that kind of behavior, they benefit from migrations from both the attacker and the attackee to go someplace where they think the person is a more high caliber person.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm the ambassador of Morocco in DC. Just want to ask you, we focus very much on the presidential election. I mean, it's very important, but I think also other elections in Congress are taking place at the same time. What is the influence of the conventions on those elections, if there are any?
I'll just take a stab at that. I think I can remember there was a time when I was chairman of the party that there were certain regions within the country that were so upset with the National Party and its stances on issues that they had to run against the Democratic National Party and its candidates at the top in order to win at home. Because, back to the point about party unity and everybody on the same page, there can be that difference in dynamic, that there's a different, perhaps in your own countries, there are different regions with sort of different cultures and different perspectives on issues and values and so forth. So when you have at the national level, a stark difference from those who may be in the other region of the country, you have this almost combat within the party. So that's what I would say in my own response. Others may have a different view, but that can have a residual fallout, if you will, too.
I can assure you this week, the Democratic Senatorial Committee and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee are holding fundraisers every night. You've got all the activists here in one place at one time, and so they can raise money to be of assistance in the fall races. That's a major benefit of the conventions vis-a-vis the House and Senate candidates.
You can also give visibility and a television platform to a candidate in a particularly in a race that you particularly want to win.
But just a reminder, this is not a party like parliamentary parties are, okay? There is no necessary link between the presidential nominee, a Senate nominee, a House nominee, a nominee for mayor. Everybody's an entrepreneur in the American system. And when they run, if they like what's happening in here in Charlotte, they'll pick up the themes, they'll invoke the name of the president. If they're running in a district where the president isn't very popular, they probably didn't even come here to Charlotte, okay? Because they're running on their own race. So this is very much, particularly compared to parliamentary democracies, this is very much every man or woman for themselves in this system.
Where?
My name is Steve Gray. I'm a resident of Charlotte. And this is the first time I've lived in a state where I feel my vote was actually going to make a difference because of the Electoral College. Most of my adult life, I've lived either in a deeply red state or a deeply blue state. And the general election, for the most part, seemed like it didn't, pertain to me. And this year it's a similar case where you have certain battleground states, and that's all that we're really looking at. And I'm wondering, is this something that the parties, they like this kind of system, or is, I wonder, get some kind of thought from the DNC and RNC chairs, to get some idea of what they think about the electoral.
I guess what gives me concern is the alternative. If it's strictly a national popular vote, and you look at our map and its demographics, it'll basically, for the most part, be a coastal election. That's where most of the people live. And I have a hard time myself, even though under this present system, Massachusetts is so predictable, you can make the argument that my vote doesn't count. But I wouldn't want to have a structured system that we put in place that basically forgoes the votes of the folks in Kansas, Nebraska, rural America. So, and it's part of it why in our system there's a difference between the term of a United States Senator and the members of Congress and so forth. So I'm not a huge fan of the Electoral College, but I haven't thought of a better alternative.
And I would disagree. I'm a big supporter of national popular vote because I think the idea, in this campaign, which is going to be a very important campaign, my guess is that neither party is going to set foot in Massachusetts, California, New York, or Texas. I think that's outrageous for the candidates not to be campaigning all over the place. And I agree, I come from a state that probably wouldn't see much of presidential candidates, but we don't anyway. We're 600,000 people. So I believe the Electoral College is an anachronism. I do not believe that people who get the fewest number of votes ought to be the ones that end up as president, regarding what happens in the Supreme Court. And I don't think the Supreme Court has any business electing presidents. So I'm in favor of NPV, and I support it.
I'm from the state of Nevada, and I love the Electoral College. But what's more important, and Elaine could do a better job on this, you also have to go back to 1789. In 1789, when our founding fathers were meeting in Philadelphia to draft our Constitution, it wasn't easy going. And there were a lot of compromises that had to be made. And that was one of the compromises, as Paul discussed, how you were going to go with 2 houses. One was going to be based, the House, on population. The other House, the Senate, would be based equally, 2 senators apiece. And that's where it was part of the original compromise in forming our nation. Now, there may be arguments that it's not effective anymore, but you really have to go back and look at the history.
I would just interject that the major issue on which there had to be compromise, which was slavery is kind of done with. So we don't have to, that's settled.
I don't want to make that association.
Listen, as somebody who worked for Al Gore in 2000, I'm totally with Howard Dean on this Electoral College. The problem is that it is in the Constitution, the danger of opening up the Constitution to amend the Constitution on this is something really nobody wants to do. There are, however, some very interesting alternatives. And one alternative is a kind of everybody hold hands and do it together, which is and you can do this by state law, allocate 2 of your Electoral College votes, the 2 that come from having your 2 senators, to the winner of the national popular vote, and then allocate your remaining Electoral College votes to whoever won the state.
For the record, there is a national popular vote bill which doesn't do that.
Right.
It allocates all the electoral votes to the person who gets the most votes, which is what I'm supporting.
You could do that, but you could do a mix. You could also do a mixed system where so that what would happen is you wouldn't have the situation. The states would still be important. Okay, you would still have some importance to key states, but you would have, in fact, you would prevent what happened in 2000, where the winner of the popular vote, in fact, didn't win the presidency, and we ended up in the Supreme Court.
And there are a number of states exploring right now what you're talking about.
A number of states are exploring this option because it kind of does a little bit of both systems.
Next question, over here.
Hello, my name's Lauren Troll. I'm a PhD in public policy student here at UNC Charlotte. And earlier you discussed how the major networks are giving only an hour of time a day. What implications does this have for painting a full picture of the party, either party, during the convention for low-income voters who may not have access to cable beyond those major networks, and how does that affect them getting involved in what's going on in the political processes?
Gene has to answer that
That's for
question.
Gene.
No, I'll answer that question. Well, I think that's not a huge gap. I mean, there's not a huge gap in terms of access to cable for low-income people. So I don't think that's I mean, there are other reasons, and there are other criticisms that I could make of our coverage, of media coverage in general, and the fact that so many people are not being engaged in the process and go into the voting booth as kind of low information voters. You know, we on cable TV, we do a lot of hooting and hollering, and sometimes more hooting and hollering than actual real discussion of issues sometimes. I think since the decline of the fairness doctrine and other sort of strictures on the broadcast networks in terms of how they cover politics, we get less of it, and I think that's or less of it in that sort of meaningful, serious way that we used to get it. So I think we're not blameless in this, but neither are other political parties either, frankly. I mean, I think we all kind of treat this more like showbiz than it really is.
Yeah, I would say the problem for low-income voters, I mean, of all the problems low-income voters face in getting involved, this is one of the smallest. I mean, the problem is that, most low-income voters probably fairly correctly believe that it's not going to have a huge effect on them one way or the other, who wins. B, they are, in this particular year, already finding that their ability to vote is being constricted by these ridiculous voter ID bills, which are fraudulent, because there were 81 cases of voter fraud in the last decade in this country. The idea that we ought to be disenfranchising millions of people from voting for that reason is absolutely outrageous.
You have to have a...
So I think there are a lot of barriers for low-income voting. I certainly wouldn't put how much television coverage is in the debates in the very...
You have to have an ID to get on an airplane. You have to have an ID to get in most federal buildings. Come on.
Well, just, getting on an airplane is not a right. Voting is a right.
But no question.
And voter ID, in my view, if there were a problem, it would make sense to solve it. But in the absence of a problem, it doesn't make sense to me. But your point is noted.
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't expect to get a big round of applause, and my expectations have been met.
Right. Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Allie. I'm a student at Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina. My question is particularly for Dr. Kamarck. We're reading your book in one of our classes for primary politics.
Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
That'll get me all of 50 cents today, but I really appreciate it.
Well, you guys characterize the election process as far as debates go and how they're broadcast as kind of a sporting event. And I'm wondering, how do we get our candidates to talk about what we really want to know, or the issues that they're afraid to talk about on broadcasting networks like climate change? How do we get them to talk about these issues? And do you think something like in other countries, how they have election regulation, such as equal airtime and free airtime for candidates, do you think that this would have an effect on substantive issues?
I've always been a fan of free airtime. I have always thought that the system that they use in a lot of the European democracies where there's free television time allotted to the political parties of a certain importance in the electorate was a terrifically good idea. It has never gotten anywhere. I've been on panels on it. I've been on commissions on it. It never got any place here, but I still think it's a good idea. As to what the candidates talk about, it's interesting. They spend a lot of time, surprisingly enough, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the voters want them to talk about. Unfortunately, and I can say this as somebody who's worked very hard on climate change, this year there's not a lot of interest in the candidates talking about climate change. I think that's unfortunate, but I think that there are so many other issues that have pushed that off the stage, particularly the economic crisis, jobs and housing, that you're not going to see candidates talk too much about it because the voters are not coming to them and saying, this is what we want to hear. Remember that these campaigns are highly professional and pretty scientific about it. They're always trying to figure out what the voters want them to talk about. So I guess I'd have to disagree with your premise that they don't talk about what the voters want them to talk about. They may not bring up the hard issues that the voters are not bringing up, but believe me, they're figuring out with all that money they spend on their focus groups, all that money they spend on polling, all the money they spend moving from place to place and talking to people, it is all geared towards trying to figure out what is the public interested in and how can I connect with the public. That is what they do. Now, in the course of that, there are issues that profoundly affect our future, like climate change, which the public for the time being has pushed off the stage, and therefore the candidates don't talk about it. I think that it is our job as interest groups, as activists within the parties, as activists in the public, to try to get that back on the stage. But at this point in the game, they're very focused on what is it that the voters are looking at. And I'll tell you this year, it's one issue, it's jobs. And almost everything else, you won't hear them talking about the war in Afghanistan. And, you know, I've got a son-in-law who just came back from Afghanistan, and we've got troops there. Nobody's talking about Afghanistan. So what happens is there's a lot of important things that don't get talked about, particularly in an election like this one, where there's one big issue that's affecting everyone.
You know, one of Gene's former colleagues at the Post, Paul Taylor,
yes,
some years ago led a coalition to try to get free airtime. I was part of it. I think you were. It was bipartisan, and we got absolutely nowhere.
No, we got nowhere on that.
But to get to your point, one of the reasons that the Debate Commission has changed the format going into this election to these 6 15-minute pods is that the moderators will have a chance to drill down on a wide variety of issues. Now, whether or not that's one of them, I can't answer. The moderators decide that, the commission doesn't.
Then let's hope that the moderators are sharpening their drill bits happy hunting for facts and positions. We've run out of time, unfortunately. So thank you all so much for you've been a great audience, and thank you, panel. Great panel. Hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Charlotte. I hope you're able to get from point A to point B more efficiently than I was this morning. But thanks so much for coming. This was a great session.
Thank you. One thing I was going to say is as we were sitting here, I couldn't help but remember that in America, we had a great music composer by the name of Irving Berlin. And he observed once that it's a lot easier to learn and get a sense of a country by listening to their music than in learning their language. And I can tell you, to understand our political system is a lot more difficult than learning the English language. So it may be that you wish this was a concert this morning, I don't know, but I hope you learned a little bit anyway. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gene.
That was fun.
Thanks, sweetie. That was fun.